I recently spent a bit of time in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, England, a place full of ancient woodland and deeply rooted in mythology and English folklore. It got me thinking about the history of the supernatural, of spirits, and of fairies. When you think of fairies, your mind is probably drawn to images of miniature people with wings, pointy ears, and waving a magic wand about, likely covered in glitter and sparkles. Maybe you start thinking of familiar illustrations of Tinkerbell and other Disney iterations of so-called fairy folk. The history of fairies, however, is complex, certainly very interesting, and I'm sure undoubtedly will pique your attention. So welcome to episode 4 of Curiosity Matters, the history of fairies. The word fairy was first mentioned in the English language in around 1330. Initially it did not mean fairies as we would know them today, but rather the word referred to magic and enchantment as well as magical and enchanted lands. It would take another 40 years for the word fairy to mean supernatural or magical being. Fairies in some sense, however, have existed well before the 1330s. Fairies, or magical beings, were being spoken about over 6,000 years ago, in 4000 BCE, and likely some time before that. We see mention of spirits by the people of ancient Sumer, who lived in ancient Mesopotamia. Sumerians are recorded as believing that spirits moved around them, inhabited all manner of places. It was accepted that fairies were present in everyday people's lives. There was no belief per se, spirits were just there. There was no debate about it. Sumerians did not have a word for fairy, but a lot of the spirits they believed in certainly did bear similarities to the fairies who came later down the line. What is clear, and worth bearing in mind throughout this clip, is that fairies and supernatural creatures alike have been used to explain phenomena by cultures, by people of the past, to explain situations they simply didn't understand, similar to belief systems, even up to this day. An example of this are ancient Mesopotamian spirits called Alu. These were dark, threatening demons with no mouths, no lips, no eyes, and would roam around at night terrifying people. It was alleged that if you were possessed by an Alu, it would cause you, as the victim, to fall into a coma or become unconscious. The Alu are seen as precursors to demons that would come later on in time, such as an incubus. These were demons associated with sleep paralysis and nighttime seductions. Iterations of magical creatures are seen throughout the Greek and Roman mythologies. Again, the Greeks and Romans did not have winged creatures as we would know as fairies now, but they had various spirits and deities such as dryads and nymphs. These were spirits linked to fertility, to trees and other nature-based themes, a common theme that runs throughout mythology. Fairies that would be recognisable to us, these beautiful entities with wings, came in around 550 BCE and are first mentioned in Persian mythology, where they are called Fairies. These Fairies are closely associated with jinns, which are supernatural beings in Islam and very interesting in their own right, quite similar to what we would call genies. Fairies have a curious story attached to them. They are said to have initially been mischievous spirits who had been denied entry to paradise and were making recompense for past misdeeds. However, in stories that were more influenced by Islamic beliefs, fairies were more kindly, protective spirits with the ability to cast love spells and help women heal from miscarriages. In perhaps an unusual form of kindness, fairies did also abduct people, but this was in order to invite humans to fairy weddings. As you can already see, fairies do not come directly from one source, and like most folkloric stories, derive from multiple sources and beliefs. In Christianity, fairies stand outside the belief system. However, some people do believe in them, but believe that they were in fact fallen angels who stood behind Satan when Satan rebelled against heaven. Cast out of heaven when Lucifer was defeated, these not fairies, were stuck in limbo and forced to live on Earth until Judgment Day. Fairy stories that we are perhaps more accustomed to, though perhaps not entirely, come from Celtic mythology. The Celts were people who lived in Europe and in the British Isles, arriving in Britain approximately 1000 BC. In Celtic folklore, fairies, the Fae, come in many forms and again aren't known as fairies but rather by other names. They were called names in Gaelic which translate to terms such as the people of the mound and the good people. These fairies, once again, were not the jolly little pixie type that we think of today, but were a supernatural race that were both feared and deeply respected. They were said to live in the otherworld, a world parallel to our own. This world is said to be the world of deities and even the dead, but was a place of everlasting youth, beauty and joy. Many mythologies all over the world have similar concepts, and this belief likely developed from the Greek and ancient religions. You'll be pleased to hear, however, that this other world, this fairyland, can be accessed by us mere mortals, allegedly through entering ancient burial mounds or via invitations. You might be aware of the ancient festivals of Samhain and Beltane, which are closely related to our Halloween and May Day festivals respectively, and they were celebrated at times where it is said that the veil between our world and the fairy world was at its thinnest, which allowed mythical beings to cross into our realm. In some tales it is said that time in this other world is unlike ours. For example, there is a story of a hero crossing into the fairy realm and returning back to our world only a couple of days later to actually find out that hundreds of years had passed. In Celtic mythologies, the fairies come in two distinct classifications: trooping and solitary fairies. Solitary fairies are the ones that live alone, such as banshees, and trooping fairies tend to gather in numbers and enjoy being together in groups, whether that be marching or dancing. Now, dancing is an interesting aspect of fairy mythology, for it is said that where fairies dance, mushrooms spring up, which is where we get the idea of fairy rings from, those mushrooms on the ground in a circle. Most beliefs surrounding these rings agree that they are dangerous places, however, and should be well avoided by us mere mortals. There are many stories throughout history which discuss what will happen to those who enter a fairy ring. It is said, for example, should you enter one of these fairy rings, you will become invisible to those outside, and that you will find it in fact impossible to leave. Fairies are then said to come and find you and will either make you dance until you go mad or die. In Welsh mythology, fairies are even said to actively try and lure mortals into these rings in order to dance with them. A common theme is that once you've entered a fairy ring, you never come back. Even in tales where a person has been pulled free of a fairy ring, it is said that these people have simply turned into dust or gone mouldy after having their first bite of food. In Celtic mythology, we do begin to see a sense of fairies that are more closely related to ourselves. No longer god-like spirits, they in fact come with a rich history, with interests, dislikes and likes. In a way, they start to become a bit more real. Fairies are reported, for example, to like such things as gold and milk and dislike salt and iron. One of the most terrifying fairies from Celtic mythology is the Dullahan, a headless horseman or coach driver who carries around his own head. It is said that in some tales he would drive his coach up to the doorstep of a person whose death was approaching. In other tales it is said that the horseman would visit houses in the County Cork area of Ireland, and whoever opened the door to the horseman would be splashed in blood. The Dullahan also allegedly used a human spine as a whip, and would use this whip in an attempt to whip out the eyes of witnesses at a hope of taking their sight. Other fearsome fairies included the Slewer. The Slewer are said to be the hosts of the unforgiven dead. It is a creature made up of evil souls and spirits that lived in and around the Scottish Highlands as well as in Ireland. Cursed to never know the afterlife, it was said that this creature was made out of mutated fairies of unbaptized people. They are reportedly so terrifying that even death himself was wary of them. Around Halloween time, this creature would take on a crescent form, much like a bird, and it would either look for people to add to its ranks as it was formed of souls, or if they were feeling particularly mischievous, they would go around and pick up people off the ground, carry them high into the sky, and then simply drop them. It is also said that they caused sickness and disease and affected the weather, as they created storms and whirlwinds to help them fly. It is certainly interesting how the term fairy, when used in other mythologies, it doesn't just relate to one type of magical entity like we perhaps use the word fairy today, but rather it refers to a raft of magical creatures, from recognisable fae names such as leprechauns and pixies to less recognisable names such as weepers or spriggans. A spriggan is a creature from Cornish folklore. It is depicted as being very ugly, with the body of an old man but the large head of a child. These creatures would send storms to destroy crops and steal children from their houses, and would replace the children with changelings who would then go on to happily destroy the houses they were in and steal cattle. Again, we see folklore from across the world being used to explain bad luck or a series of unfortunate circumstances. Magic and stories relating to the occult has always been a tool that has been used not only to explain the unexplainable at whatever time it was used, but it was also used to control people. What I mean by this is look at examples of witchcraft from the 16th and 17th centuries, where the idea of witches being among us was an excuse in some ways to attack and persecute mainly women and prevent women from deviating from the mother-wife role they were expected to permanently occupy. This ideology of witchcraft in part came from folkloric stories told centuries beforehand. Now, I make reference to it being a controlling tool because during the 16th and 17th century, where English so-called witches were being sent to trial and murdered, Celtic communities were not conducting trials in anywhere near the same number as their English counterparts. A suggested reason for this is that Celtic cultures had a much richer, deeper history of folklore compared to the English. In Scotland and Ireland, for example, they feared fairies and other supernatural beings more than witches. They did believe in witches, but the behaviour being attributed to witches in England were behaviours that the Scottish and Irish attributed to fairies. In essence, the Celts blamed other spirits, not witches, for their misfortune, so it made no sense for them to go after the witches, as it were. They also treated incidences concerning alleged witchcraft differently and would aim for more community-focused resolutions. For example, they would try to use mediation between the so-called witch and the accuser, where some outcomes included a promise that the curse would be lifted or just an apology between two parties. The English, simply put, had a less diverse range of supernatural beings, so witchcraft and witches unfortunately bore the brunt. I'm going to jump forward now to the 19th century, to the time of the Victorians and to fairy mania. The Victorians are known for perhaps being a very strict, practical type of people, so it is unusual that they were gripped by the idea of fairies. It went further than just an idea, however, as many people genuinely believed in fairies. This included scholars, scientists, and even religious types. This mania developed for several reasons. First, folklore and myth was being rediscovered. Fantastical stories were being heard again, and it was allowing people to escape. There were stories of magic available to them. Think of William Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night Dream, the tales of Brothers Grimm, the publication of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, which cemented fairies into British literature. The Victorian time was also a time of significant scientific and industrial growth, and like many of us today who seek to simplify our lives by switching back to more analogue devices, putting our phones away, some Victorians were yearning for a simpler, more magical time. However, given the meticulous nature of the Victorians, they also did make sure that they used science to prove the existence of fairies. What I mean about using science is that we had incidences of Victorian scientists attributing historical finds they couldn't understand to belonging to fairies. A lot of research was conducted by well-respected people. Walter Scott would argue that if you believed in God, then there was just as much evidence to believe that fairies existed, which, fair enough. And as I said earlier, although believing in fairies was against Christianity, arguments were put forward that perhaps fairies were, as I said, fallen angels, which meant that Christianity could explain fairies, and you could therefore, in a roundabout way, as a Christian, believe in fairies of a sort and still stay committed to your faith. In around 1900, a Scottish minister is recorded as saying that fairies were real, but only visible in a state of mystic ecstasy. There's been a lot written about pagan influence and the differing views from within certain quarters about whether paganism was a precursor to Christianity. The idea of paganism being directly linked to Christianity gained so much traction in the Victorian period that many started to believe in the pagan survival theory, which basically hypothesized that fairies were old pagan gods which had been demoted once Christianity had become the dominant religion. The Victorian era also transformed the appearance of fairies from dangerous, potentially evil creatures into the winged, small, childish-like figures we are familiar with today. This was mainly due to artists beginning to popularise this new image, especially within children's literature. The idea of making fairies look sweet also carried over into other art forms, such as in pantomime, where at the end of a Victorian pantomime, a great horde of children would run onto the stage dressed as fairies. It is clear that Victorians had a hankering for more wild, natural times full of magic and fairies, and this was reflected in traditions that were also made popular by the Victorians. For example, they were first to put the fairy decoration on the top of their Christmas tree, and this was said to ward off evil spirits and bring happiness. For an era which is stereotyped as being very formal, the Victorians certainly loved a bit of whimsy, and they certainly loved their fairies. I'll jump forward now to the year 1917, just after the end of the Victorian era, in order to tell you about the biggest fairy story from the modern era, the Cottingley fairies. There has been a lot written about this subject, but in essence there were two young girls, Elsie and Frances. They were cousins, and they allegedly took some photographs with what was said to be with a group of fairies. Although many believed the photographs correctly to be a hoax, many did not. One of the believers, as it were, was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes books. And he in fact believed that the photos proved the existence of the supernatural. I do wonder what the great detective himself would have made of his creator's deductions. I won't go too much into how the hoax garnered so much publicity, but there are many articles dedicated to this matter. But in summary, it turned out that these fairies were cardboard cutouts. But this was not admitted by the cousins until 1983. Interestingly, however, they did maintain that although most of the photos were fake, they still said that they had seen real fairies. I say most of the photos as Frances insisted that one photo did show a real fairy, a claim that her cousin, on the other hand, denied. Amusingly, they claimed the reason for keeping the hoax going for so long was that they were embarrassed to admit the real truth to Doyle after he got involved. 21st century fairy belief is still alive in some way, and perhaps growing, given how many of us, as I mentioned, are trying to shun modern influences. Fairies associated with ancient mythology, like those that sit under the umbrella of paganism, are growing. In these communities, fairies are going back to their roots, as it were, and they are now viewed as not the Tinkerbell sort of creatures that the Victorians popularised, but they are seen as powerful beings that need to be respected. Although not all followers of these faiths believe in fairies necessarily, fairies are being used as metaphors that represent the natural world. Many of us these days, even if we don't believe in fairies, still adhere to teachings surrounding fairy lore, such as avoiding fairy circles or making sure we don't disturb fairy forts. In Iceland, they have even moved construction projects in order to avoid upsetting fairy settlers that live under the ground. Fairies, as you can tell, have a long and complex history, which I've hardly uncovered in this episode. It is a rich, interesting, important history that encompasses culture and people from across the world and from across the ages. If you found this episode interesting, I would thoroughly recommend you take a deep dive. Take the initiative and go and find out more about fairy lore. There are truly some fantastic stories out there which will either leave you with a smile or a chill running down your spine. I have included all the sources I used to make this episode in the description below, so that's perhaps a good place to start if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the history of fairies. All that's left for me to say is thank you very, very much for tuning into this episode, and I will see you at the next one. Goodbye.